guys. Good evening, everybody. I trust that you're well and also hope that you had an amazing day. All right, so we're going to be starting with our lesson today. And before we do, you're going to go on to our A plus student.ca page. And then we're going to log in with our username as well as our password. All right, so once you've logged in with your username as well as your password, and then you're going to choose subject or select the subject of language arts. All right, so once the subject of language arts has selected, then we're going to choose grade 3, right? Because we are doing grade 3. All right, so once you have chosen the subject of language arts, we're going to scroll down up until we get the chapter of adjectives and adverbs. So chapter is adjectives, adverbs. All right, so within our chapter today, the two lessons that we'll be focusing on is the first lesson on choose between adjective and adverbs, and the second one, which is the word an adjective or adverb. So you're either going to choose between adjectives and adverbs, and then the second lesson will be is the word an adjective or adverb. All right, so we're going into our first lesson on choose between adjectives and adverbs, right? And we're first going to get an explanation of what an adjective is, as well as an adverb is, what an adjective is, as well as an adverb. All right, so firstly, an adjective, right? It either describes, modifies, or it tells us about the noun, right? It either tells us what kind, or it can tell us how many. It tells us what kind or how many, right? So that is an adjective. And we have an adverb, and an adverb tells us about the verb, right? It either tells us about the verb, adjective, or another adverb. And an adverb, it tells us how, when, and where, right? And sometimes it will also tell us maybe to what degree or to what extent. But in this case, we're only going to make mention that it tells us how, when, and it also tells us where, right? All right, let's quickly go back to our tutorial. An adjective is a word that tells us about the noun, right? It tells us about the noun, describes a noun, modifies them, right? So it mainly tells us about the noun, right? And adjectives, it often tells us what kind, or it can tell us how many, right? Doesn't have to necessarily tell us 1, 2, 3, so many, right? It can be a different way too. And what kind, it's like maybe where you kind of describe what type of what kind it is. For example, Jody saw 3 stars in the sky. So the word 3, right, it tells us how many stars Jody saw in the sky, right? So the adjective tells us how many stars Jody saw in the sky, right? Once again, an adjective is a word that tells us about a noun, tells us what kind, or it tells us how many, right? And if we go back to our whiteboard, right? We go back, then there's a few examples of adjectives, right? And then we can say, that is a beautiful dress. So does it tell us what kind or how many, right? So that is a beautiful dress, right? Which means that beautiful, it tells us what kind of dress it is. It is a beautiful dress. So the adjective is beautiful, right? And it tells us what kind of dress. He is a happy man. He is a happy man, right? So happy, right? It tells us what kind of man it is. It's a happy man, right? It's not a sad man. It's not a frustrated man. It's not an angry man, but it's a happy man, right? So it tells us what kind. It is a happy man. The sky is blue, right? The sky is blue. So blue tells us about the sky, right? It is blue. I am a busy girl. So busy tells us what kind of girl she is. She's a busy girl, right? So that is basically an adjective that tells us about the noun. And it tells us what kind, and it also tells us how many, right? He has 3 dogs, right? How many dogs? 3 dogs. That is just a random example. All right, going back to our tutorial. Then we have an adverb. An adverb, it is a word that tells us about the verb, right? So an adverb is a word that tells us about a verb. And adverbs, it often tells us how, it often tells us when, or it often tells us when, right? So when it tells us how, when, or where, it doesn't necessarily have to give us a when, doesn't have to be Thursday or Friday or 2 o'clock, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that. And where, it doesn't necessarily have to also tell us a specific place, right? It doesn't um which country or state or city, right? So if we look at the first example, it says Grace ran quickly, right? So quickly, it tells us how Grace ran, right? And remember, we see that in adverb, it often tells us how, when, or where, right? So Grace ran quickly, right? And that tells us how Grace ran. And most of the adverbs that tells us how they end in ly. Not necessarily everything, but most of it, right? Most of the adverbs that tells us how it ends in ly. For example, Grace ran quickly, right? ly. So instead of saying Grace ran quick, we say Grace ran quickly, right? And remember, we said most of it tells us that tells us how ends in ly, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is every time or all of the adverbs, right? So you can always use ly to tell whether a word is an adjective or an adverb, right? For example, Here it says, she arrives soon, right? So soon, it is an adverb, but it does not end in ly, right? And you see, here it comes word where I said where, right? Or when, let's say when. When doesn't necessarily have to be on Tuesday or Monday, giving a specific date or time, but you can also say soon. So soon tells us when she will arrive, right? She arrives soon, and it does not end in ly. Fred has a friendly dog, right? So even though we say that most of the adverbs that tells us how it ends in ly, so it doesn't necessarily mean that because the word ends in an ly, it is an adverb, right? Because some of the adjectives also ends in ly. For example, Fred has a friendly dog. So friendly, it ends in ly, and friendly is an adjective that does not, it does not end in ly. That ends, sorry, in ly. And friendly, it tells us what kind of dog it is. It is a friendly dog, right? And remember, like I say, as much as an adverb tells us how ending ly, right? You can find adjectives that end in ly, and not all of the adverbs end in ly. Some does not end in ly. Look at this one, soon, right? And soon is an adverb that doesn't end in ly, and it tells us when. All right, we need to insert the correct missing verb within the sentence, right? My father's bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup, right? So usually if you were to have nice hot homemade soup, fresh bread would be delicious with that, right? So my father's bread with my father's fresh bread tasted delicious with the homemade soup. So fresh is the correct word, right? It is the missing verb within that sentence, right? It says correct the missing verb. Tasted, which means that tasted delicious. So fresh. So we added the word fresh to add to the missing word within that sentence. All right. We need to enter the correct missing verb within the sentence. Look what, and you'll see the directions at the bottom of the page. Do we need to say look close or look closely? So look close, and you'll see the directions at the bottom of the page, or look closely, and you'll see the directions at the bottom of the page. We need to choose between the word close or closely, right? The missing verb. So we're going to say look closely, and you'll see the directions at the bottom of the page. So we are adding closely, right? Closely. And here it says the word look is a verb, so it must be described by an adverb, right? Because we said, remember, an adverb, it tells us about the verb. So close is an adjective, right? So close is an adjective. And even though you may hear it used as an adverb in casual speech, right? So it depends. So close, usually in casual speech, we'll mention close as in something that you are doing, right? But closely is the adverb that tells us about the verb look. All right. So Pamela and Yin smile at the visitors, right? So we need to choose the correct word to fit in after smile. So is it shy or shyly? We need to choose, or here it says insert the correct verb within the sentence. So Pamela and Yin smile. Is it shy or shyly at the visitors? Smile is an action that you're doing, which means that it is a verb, right? All right, so smile, if smile is a verb, then the adverb is shyly, right? Shy is an adjective, right? Shy is an adjective, and shyly is an adverb that tells us about the verb, which is smile. Shyly. All right. So that is the difference between an adjective as well as an adverb. And we said an adjective, it is a word that tells us about the noun, right? An adjective, it often tells us what kind, or it can tell us how many. So either how many, where you can like maybe say one, three, five, something, right? That tells us how many. Or it can have what kind, and you can either say beautiful dress, tells us what kind of dress. The shy, right? It tells us what kind of girl. She's shy, right? So those are adjectives. Then we have adverbs, and it's a word that tells us about the verb, right? And adjectives often tells us how, when, or where. And most of the adverbs that tells us how, right? It ends in ly, right? It ends in ly. However, not all of the adverbs end in ly. For example, she arrives soon, and soon tells when she will arrive, right? And then you also get adjectives that ends in ly. For example, friendly, right? That is but an example of an adjective that ends in ly. All right, so now we're going to do a little test before we go on the next lesson. All right, so you need to choose or insert the correct missing verb within the sentence. Mrs. Pittman, is it carefully or careful, lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf? So Mrs. Pittman carefully or careful lifted the glass bowl onto the top shelf. All right, so if it is a verb, right? So lifted is a verb, right? Which means that we need to choose the adverb that basically tells us about the verb lifted, and carefully, right? It tells us how Mrs. Pittman lifted the glass bowl. So beautiful. If you said carefully, then well done. All right, so Katie and Sandra, neat or neatly packed their clothes for their vacation in Arizona. So Katie and Sandra neatly packed their clothes for their vacation in Arizona. We need to insert the correct missing verb within the sentence. Tells us how they packed their clothes for the vacation in Arizona. All right, so we are going to choose the word neatly, right? And neatly is the adverb that tells us how Katie and Sandra packed their clothes for the vacation in Arizona. All right, will Mrs. Lee be driving to work at the usual time or at the usual time? Will Mrs. Lee be driving to work at the time or at the usual time? All right, so we're going to choose usually, right? And as you can see, usually is incorrect, right? So what happens is that if, for example, you maybe find a word that is incorrect, right, then it sometimes means that it can be so tricky. Like usually and usual, the words also like kind of sound the same, right? So sometimes we also get confused when you need friends, for example, in this case, between an adjective as well as an adverb, right? Get a test, then of course there will be trick questions, right? So if you get incorrect, then it will correct or tick the correct mark. However, you will then have to look for the maybe the correct word, right? And then once you find the correct word, then copy the link and send it to us, and then you will definitely get 100 bonus points, right? So you copy the link once you get the correct answer, especially since the test questions can be so tricky. And then you send the link to us, and then you will get 100 bonus points. All right, so we've got that. Okay, so now if we go back and we go to the next lesson, right? So we just now finished that lesson choosing between an adjective as well as an adverb. Now we are going to do the lesson on is the word an adjective, adverb. So we first had to choose between the adjective and adverbs. Now we need to say if the specific words that we are going to identify, is it an adjective or an adverb? So let's go into the next lesson. All right, so we need to look at the underlined words, right? Is the underlined word an adjective or an adverb, right? And you need to also say why it is an adjective or an adverb if you identify it as adverb or adjective. The gray clouds moved slowly in the sky. We need to say if the underlined word is an adjective or an adverb. So the gray clouds moved slowly in the sky. Slowly. All right, so slowly it is definitely an adverb, right? And it tells us how the clouds, the gray clouds, are moving, right? tells us how it's moving, tells us about the verb moved. It is moving slowly. All right. Lacey certainly knows the art of arranging flowers. So Lacey certainly knows the arranging flowers. All right, so certainly the word, underline word certainly, right? It is an adverb, right? And it tells us about the verb that she knows, right? So certainly, she's certain that she knows, certainly knows the art of arranging flowers. The game stopped when someone suddenly got hurt. The game stopped when someone suddenly got hurt. The word suddenly, we need to say if it's an adjective or an adverb. Suddenly. All right, so the game stopped when someone got hurt, right? So suddenly is an adverb. It's an adverb, right? And it tells us how the person got hurt. So suddenly this person got hurt. All right, so before we go to our test, let us quickly go to the page that you see in front of you, right? So we said an adverb, it tells us about the verb. It either tells us about or another adverb, but for now it only tells us about the verb, right? And it tells us how, when, and where. Shane is very sleepy, right? Shane is very sleepy. So yeah, see, it doesn't end in ly, but it tells us how sleepy Shane is. Very sleepy, right? Go to bed now. Go to bed now, right? And now it tells us when. You see, it doesn't say go to bed 9 o'clock, go to bed at 10 o'clock. No, it says now. Or we can even say soon, right? And that will tell us when. Jesse is always on time. That will tell us when Jesse is on time. So always on time, right? All right, so that is basically also an adverb that tells us about the verb. So now we're going to do a little activity before we do the test, right? To test us on is the word an adjective or an adverb. And before we test ourselves, we are going to do a little activity and then we will go back to the test. All right, so you need to underline the adjectives within the sentence, right? And we see that an adjective, it tells us about the noun. It either tells us what kind or it tells us how many, right? The beautiful trees blew quietly in the wind. So the beautiful trees blew quietly in the wind. We need to underline the adjective within the sentence. The beautiful trees blew quietly in the wind. All right, so we will then say the beautiful trees because it tells us what kind of trees, right? It's beautiful trees. They all had brown hair and green eyes. They all had brown hair and green eyes. All right, so we are going to choose brown for hair that describes what kind of hair, and green eyes, right? Tells us what kind of eyes or what color the eyes are. So brown and green describes the hair or tells us about the eyes. Tall boys at the front called the teacher. Tall boys at the front called the teacher. All right, so what kind of boys? We can then say tall boys, right? At the front called the teacher. So tall tells us what kind of boys, or tells us about the boys. Sweet strawberries are the best. So tall, well done. Sweet strawberries are the best. We need to choose the correct adjective, right? Sweet strawberry. Strawberries are the best. All right, so sweet. What kind of strawberries? Sweet strawberries, right? Instead of saying red strawberries, green strawberries, bitter strawberries, we can say sweet strawberries are the best. I don't like yellow bananas. They are too soft. I don't like yellow bananas. They are too soft. All right, so yellow, beautiful. So well done. So yes, yellow is correct. I don't like yellow bananas, right? They are too soft, which maybe means that she likes the green ones, right? But here they are talking about the yellow ones. The yellow flowers were tall and beautiful. So the yellow flowers were tall and beautiful. All right. So what kind of flowers? The yellow flowers. So instead of saying the red flowers, the green flowers, the white flowers, whatever flowers, they are specifically saying the yellow flowers. They were tall and beautiful. Where are my thick pants? Asked his father. Where are my thick pants? Asked his father. What kind of pants? All right, so the father's looking for his thick pants, right? He's not looking for his brown pants, he's not looking for his denim pants, he's looking for his thick pants, right? So, this is basically an activity on adjectives and identifying the adjectives within the sentence. So, yes, thick is correct, right? All right, so if we now go back to the test, right, on is the word an adjective or an adverb, right? Remember, we said an adverb, it tells us about a verb, right? And it either tells us how, when, or where. And an adjective, it tells us about the noun, and it either tells us what kind or it tells us how many, right? So now we're going to say, is the word an adjective or an adverb? Let's start the test. All right, so we're going to look at the underlined word, right? And then we're going to say if it's an adjective or an. So the sudden storm brought the outdoor event to an end. So the sudden storm brought the out event to an end. Is this an adjective? So sudden is the adjective or is the adverb? All right, so someone says an adverb. Okay, let's quickly choose the adverb, right? So an adverb is incorrect, right? Remember, as much as a storm is something that has action, right? But we're not specifically talking about the wind and the rain and so on. We are just identifying the storm, right? It's like saying rain or the sun, right? But it's not saying it is sunny, right? So the sudden storm, which means that the storm is actually a noun, right? So sudden is an adjective, right? So remember, it can be very tricky. These test questions are usually very tricky. And whenever you find that the test questions are tricky and you maybe get a word that is incorrect, right? That is fine. But what you can always just do is you can then find the correct word and then you can copy the link once you find it and then send it to us and you will get 100 bonus points, right? Oopsie. All right, so sudden is an adjective, right? It's an adjective, but well done for trying. The women quickly grabbed a sandwich after work. The women quickly grabbed a sandwich after work. So quickly, is that an adjective or is an adverb? Quickly grab. So quickly grabbed. All right. So quickly grabbed, right? Quickly tells us about how he grabbed the sandwich. So well done. Well done. The sad little puppy was happy to be rescued. So the sad little puppy was happy to be rescued. Is sad an adjective or is sad an adverb? Sad little puppy tells us what kind of puppy, right? So we will say it's an adjective. So well done. Yes, it is an adjective and it tells us what kind of puppy. Right, so we're going to do the last one. Tyler reads quietly for hours in his cozy bed. Quietly is an adjective or an adverb. Tyler reads quietly for hours in his cozy bed. Quietly. Is that an adjective or an adverb? And yep, it is an adverb, right? So quietly, it tells us how he reads. So well done, well done. All right, so that is basically our lesson on adjective and adverbs, right? And we did the lessons on choosing between an adjective and an adverb, as well as is the word an adjective or an adverb. And just to recap, we said that an adjective, it tells us about the noun. It either tells us what kind or it tells us how many. And then adverb, it tells us about the verb. And it either tells us how, when, or where. And most of the adverbs that tells us how, and in ly, right? Like maybe quickly, quietly, right? That tells us how and the verb, right? So it tells us how. All right, so before we end, we're just going to read and before we do that, can you go and log into a+classes.ca? So we're going to a+classes.ca, learning materials. Let's go to grade 3 and reading. Then we go straight down, right down. Oh, it does not have that one. Let's go to reading. Once you go to reading, you go right down up until you get the um, purple boxes. So not the beginner's phonics book, not the reading fluency. We are going to read along audiobooks level 1. All right, so we are going to open up the book on who likes to swim. So since it's almost summertime, we all like to swim. All right. So that is just a little reading piece on who likes to swim, right? And in the book, they told us different animals, even people that likes to swim. All right, grade threes, that is the end of our lesson on adjectives and adverbs. Thank you very much for joining our class and thank you very much for being interactive. Till next time, have an amazing evening. Goodbye.